Hello and welcome to Byjus Exam Prep. Welcome to another episode of our knowledge series. In this session, we're going to take up a discussion on a very important topic under Environment and Ecology, that is the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol is part of the Climate Change Convention. It's a very important topic for both prelims and mains because UPSC has asked quite a few questions on this topic. Even though it's an old topic, it's an old static topic, it still continues to remain relevant till this day. So in this session, let's understand everything that is there to be understood with regard to the Kyoto Protocol. If you're liking these initiatives, before we begin, press the like button, share your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So first and foremost, what is the Kyoto Protocol? See, the Kyoto Protocol is an agreement signed as part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. In 1992, a major environment-related summit was held called the Rio Earth Summit. This is a landmark summit in the field of environment, climate change and biodiversity conservation. Because at the Rio Earth Summit, all the countries, they came together and they worked out several important agreements and conventions which were designed to protect our environment. So that is when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was brought out. For the first time, the world was taking climate change seriously and global efforts were initiated to tackle the threat posed by climate change and global warming. Along with that, the Convention on Biological Diversity was also adopted to conserve and protect our biodiversity. Even the UN Convention to Combat Desertification was also adopted to tackle the threat of soil degradation and desertification. So the Rio Earth Summit was a landmark event that gave birth to important conventions, international conventions in the field of environment and biodiversity protection. One of the most important conventions was the UNFCCC, that was a dedicated platform to fight climate change. So every year from 1992, the Conference of Parties would be held under the UNFCCC. The countries around the world, all the UN members, they would come together at the Conference of Parties and discuss ways and measures to tackle the threat posed by climate change. Because by now, climate science had evolved. Scientific evidence had emerged that greenhouse gas emissions, which were a result of our industrial agricultural activities, they were directly responsible for rising temperatures that we refer to as global warming. As you know, greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, etc., they trap more heat in the atmosphere and thereby directly contribute to the heating of the atmosphere. So in general, we refer to this phenomena as global warming. See, global warming does take place naturally as well, but anthropogenic activities, that is human activities, it has accelerated global warming. Deforestation, industrial development and industrial activities, emissions from vehicles and industries, they've all contributed to increasing concentration of GHGs or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, thereby trapping more heat and triggering global warming around the world. Global warming can result in melting of the ice caps and glaciers. This will result in rising sea levels that could submerge low-lying coastal areas. It can alter oceanic currents, jet streams, and weather patterns, and can lead to irreversible changes in climatic and weather patterns around the world. So this could have a devastating impact on our ecosystems, on agricultural productivity, on human health, and as well as on our biodiversity. So since climate science was evolving and scientific evidence was being brought out by institutions like IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it was conclusively being proven that human activities were directly responsible for global warming and climate change. So finally, under the UN Convention on Climate Change, countries, they started acting together, they started working together, and they would meet at the Conference of Parties every year. The idea was to work out a way through which the emissions could be brought down, through which emission intensity could be brought down so that we can tackle global warming and climate change in the long run. So under this convention, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, after a few years of negotiations, in 1997, a very important agreement was worked out that is known as the Kyoto Protocol. It was signed in the year 1997 when the Conference of Parties was held at Kyoto, which is a city in Japan. This happened to be the first major agreement, a binding agreement that was signed under the Climate Change Convention. It was signed 5 years after the Climate Change Convention was launched. In 1997, this was the first binding agreement that was signed under the Climate Change Convention. So this is referred to as the Kyoto Protocol, and 192 countries, almost every country in the world, almost every UN member signed and ratified this convention. However, Canada did withdraw later, but that's a later development. Canada withdrew from Kyoto Protocol in 2012. Few countries haven't ratified it at all, like United States, for example. The US was part of the negotiations, but it never ratified the Kyoto Protocol. So let's understand a little more about this important agreement that is related to climate change and global warming. See, under the Kyoto Protocol, the greenhouse gases which had to be targeted were identified. That is something that's unique about the Kyoto Protocol. It was a very specific agreement which had specific provisions on how to tackle the threat posed by climate change. So this protocol identified specific greenhouse gases that were directly responsible for global warming. This was based on scientific evidence, based on climate science. Greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, N2O or nitrous oxide, HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, PFCs, perfluorocarbons, and SF6, sulfur hexafluoride. These dangerous greenhouse gases, they were identified. Their contribution to global warming was exactly quantified, and it was brought out through an index known as the global warming potential. Global warming potential of a greenhouse gas indicates the ability of this gas to contribute to global warming. As you can see, all the greenhouse gases listed here, they have tremendous potential to cause global warming. To determine the global warming potential, CO2 is taken as the reference. Carbon dioxide is the reference. That is why the global warming potential for CO2 is 1. So using CO2 as a reference, the ability to cause or contribute to global warming from other gases is calculated and quantified. So based on that, it is said that methane, CH4, it contributes 21 times more than carbon dioxide to global warming. Similarly, nitrous oxide, HFCs, PFCs, they all contribute many times more than what CO2 does to global warming. That is, one ton of methane will be 21 times more deadlier. It will be more prone to capture heat as compared to 1 ton of carbon dioxide. As you can see, nitrous oxide is 310 times more potent when it comes to capturing heat and retaining heat. HFCs and PFCs are thousands of times more potent, and the most potent is SF6, sulfur hexafluoride, which is nearly 24,000 times more potent than CO2 when it comes to capturing heat in the atmosphere. But thankfully, the most prominent greenhouse gas is CO2, followed by methane. The other greenhouse gases which have a very high global warming potential, their concentration level is less. So as a result, they don't contribute much to global warming as much as CO2 and methane. It's mainly because of their volume and distribution in the atmosphere. But nevertheless, all these are major greenhouse gases which significantly contribute to global warming. So these greenhouse gases were specifically identified by the Kyoto Protocol. Their sources of emission was also identified. What sources are contributing to these emissions? So based on this, a plan was worked out. A strategy was brought out which would place binding targets on certain countries to bring down the emissions of these greenhouse gases. So for prelims, please remember the greenhouse gases that were identified by Kyoto Protocol, remember their global warming potential and the sources of their emission. So based on this, Kyoto Protocol provided for operationalizing the Climate Change Convention. It placed the primary responsibility on industrialized countries and economies in transition, which were mainly responsible for historical emissions. The developed countries, industrialized nations, the Western countries in particular, European countries, a few industrialized nations and economies in transition. These countries were identified, they were placed under a separate category, a separate annex, and they were given a separate set of responsibilities. The primary principle of Kyoto Protocol is CBDR. This is the underlying principle of Kyoto Protocol. CBDR stands for Common but Differentiated Responsibilities. This principle was mainly pushed by developing nations led by India and even by China. See, this is where you need to understand that at climate change negotiations, there has always been a divide. There has always been a conflict between the developed countries and the developing and underdeveloped nations. Developed countries have always been on one side, they have a different argument. Developing nations have been on the other side of the conflict, along with underdeveloped countries, LDCs or least developed countries, and small island states. They've all been on one side opposing the policies and initiatives of developed nations. So what is this divide all about? See, when it comes to climate change, greenhouse gases have been emitted into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That is when we humans started burning fossil fuels in large quantities. That is when agriculture started expanding, industrial activities expanded, deforestation increased. We were destroying natural carbon sinks, we were extracting fossil fuels, that is crude oil and gas, burning them to power our industries, vehicles, transportation, etc. So from late 1700s and early 1800s is when we started releasing GHGs in large quantities. When Industrial Revolution happened in Europe, massive amount of greenhouse gases were released, and these countries are developed today because they could freely burn fossil fuels for 150 to 200 years. If you look at countries like, let's say, Canada, US, European nations, even Russia and Japan, the reason why they are developed today is because they were able to freely burn fossil fuels to power their transportation sector and to power their industries. So this is what we refer to as historical emissions. They are responsible for large part of climate change that has happened. These developed industrialized nations and economies in transition, they are largely responsible for releasing GHGs in large quantities since 150 years. Whereas countries like, let's say, India, or even China for that matter, or Sri Lanka, or small Pacific islands, small African nations, they are not responsible for historical emissions. These countries have been burning fossil fuels only in the last few decades. Today, India, China might be the top emitters, but our emissions have increased only in the last 40-50 years. So why should these countries bear the burden for historical emissions? This was always the question raised by developing nations and underdeveloped nations. Why should we be responsible for historical emissions? Because if we take up targets and if we try to bring down our emissions, that could compromise our economic growth. For countries like India or even Bangladesh, or let's say small Asian and African countries, they can't afford to invest immediately in cleaner technologies and renewable energy. They still need to depend on fossil fuels for some years because they have a bigger socio-economic concern. These countries are poor countries. They're dealing with poverty. They still have major socio-economic challenges. And the best way to overcome these challenges is through economic growth. And to power economic growth, you need fossil fuels. You have to burn fossil fuels at least for some time. So that is why the developing nations, underdeveloped nations, LDCs, small island states, they all came under the leadership of India and China. And during climate change negotiations, especially when Kyoto Protocol was negotiated, they pushed historical emissions on developed and industrialized nations. We said, fighting climate change is a common goal. No doubt, every country has a common objective. But the responsibilities has to be differentiated. We can't take the same responsibility as US, as UK, as France, as Italy. Those countries are developed, they have achieved their socio-economic goals, they should be responsible for historical emissions. They are the ones who released GHGs in the last 150 years. So our argument was, let them take up historical responsibilities for historical emissions. That was the argument made by India and the other developing nations. So based on this, a principle was inculcated into Kyoto Protocol known as CBDR, that is common but differentiated responsibilities. This is the very foundation of the Kyoto Protocol. It provides for equitable division of responsibilities based on the capacities of those countries and based on the historical responsibilities of those countries. So accordingly, industrialized nations, developed nations, and few economies in transition, few European Central Asian countries, which had burnt fossil fuels for at least few decades or at least 100 years, those were identified and they were made responsible for historical emissions and historical responsibilities. So that is why CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities. That is, fighting climate change is a common goal, but the responsibilities are differentiated. So the convention placed these responsibilities on few countries and they had to follow these binding targets. They had to report periodically and submit themselves to periodic reviews and monitoring through the Climate Change Convention. That is what is important about the Kyoto Protocol. It divided these countries through an annex-based structure. Countries have been placed under different annexes based on their historical emissions and based on their historical responsibilities. Now, if you look at this graph, you can clearly see that developed nations, industrialized nations like US, European countries, Russia, Japan, they are responsible for historical emissions since the 1800s. That is, since the days of the Industrial Revolution. So in the last 150 odd years, these were the countries which reaped the benefits of burning fossil fuel. This is how they triggered their economic growth. This is how they solved their socio-economic problems, but they ended up releasing GHGs and causing global warming and climate change. So they are responsible for these historical emissions and they should take up more responsibilities. Now compare this with the emissions of countries like India or even Brazil. Right? Developing nations and smaller underdeveloped countries, their contribution to historical emissions is negligible. India and other countries like Brazil, we have been burning fossil fuels maybe in the last 40-50 years, right? So we shouldn't be responsible for historical emissions. This is the argument that has been ingrained into Kyoto Protocol through the CBDR principle. This is at the very heart of Kyoto Protocol. Common but differentiated responsibilities. Now we can justify this argument even by looking at per capita emissions of countries. This graph over here is showing you the per capita emissions of countries as of 2006. If you look at India's per capita emissions, it is just 1.2 tons of CO2 per individual. Per capita emissions of countries like India and even Brazil is very, very low. Now compare this with per capita emissions of US, Australia, Canada. It is 18 times higher than India. Per capita emissions of US was 19.3 tons of CO2 per individual as of 2006. See, as of now, that is by 2021, India's per capita emissions has gone up to 1.8 or 1.9 tons of CO2. But still this is very, very low compared to per capita emissions in Europe, in North America, and in other developed industrialized nations. So when our per capita emissions are so low, when we have developmental challenges to meet, we shouldn't be responsible for historical emissions. This was the argument put forward by India, China, and other developing nations through a grouping known as the G77. G77 brought together all the developing, underdeveloped nations, including the least developed countries and small island states. They put up a fight against the developed, industrialized nations, and they managed to put in place a historic agreement known as the Kyoto Protocol. So under the Kyoto Protocol, countries were placed into different annexes, and Annex B countries, countries listed under Annex B, they were given a set of binding emission targets. They had to reduce their emissions through clean technologies and renewable energy. Around 39 industrialized countries, developed nations, economies in transition, they were identified and they were given a set of binding emission reduction targets. That is, they have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions as prescribed by Kyoto Protocol. The target of Kyoto Protocol was to reduce emissions by 5% as compared to 1990 levels over a 5-year period between 2008 and 2012. This was the first period when Kyoto Protocol was actually implemented and enforced. See, even though this was signed in 1997, it was not implemented until 2008. Why? Because of the conflict between developing and developed nations. For 1 decade, the conflict carried on, it went on. The provisions of the protocol, they were not strictly enforced or implemented for almost 1 decade. The US in particular was blocking its implementation, and it eventually did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. Finally, after several rounds of negotiations, in 2008, the first round of implementation was provided for, and Kyoto Protocol was implemented for 5 years in the first commitment period. During this period, more than 30 industrialized developed nations, they were placed under Annex B. It's basically a list of countries. These countries were given binding emission targets, and they had to achieve and meet these targets. Here in this infographic, you can see the Annex B countries. They include countries like Australia, many European nations, countries like United States, right? Essentially, these are industrialized nations, developed nations, and a few economies in transition. There is also something known as Annex 1 countries, which are under Annex 1 list. These countries, they accepted to take the responsibility. It's more or less the same list. Under Annex 1, there are a list of countries, again developed and industrialized nations, which accepted to take binding targets. And the specific targets are mentioned under Annex B. So they have to invest in cleaner technologies and shift their economy from carbon-based economy to cleaner economy. The other nations, developing, underdeveloped nations, which have no binding targets, they are called as non-annex countries. Countries like India, China, Israel, and all the other small countries you can think of. So most of these countries were placed under non-annex list. They didn't have any binding targets, no targets on them. Whereas for Annex B countries, countries which had accepted to take up the responsibility under Annex 1, they were placed under Annex B, and they were given a set of binding emission reduction targets. Is that clear? So this is why the Kyoto Protocol is so important. It clearly specified the targets and the responsibilities, and also put in place a review mechanism and a monitoring mechanism. Now, this protocol was later amended in 2012 through the Doha Amendment. During the Doha Conference of Parties that was held in 2012, a few changes were introduced into Kyoto Protocol to extend its implementation for a second period between 2013 and 2020. Its implementation was extended by 7 more years after 2012, because otherwise Kyoto Protocol would have expired. Right? We didn't have any other climate change agreement. So at the Doha Conference of Parties, Kyoto Protocol was extended for the second period. That is, it was supposed to be implemented for 7 more years from 2013 to 2020. Through these amendments, a few new commitments were placed on the Annex 1 countries. The countries which had agreed to take additional responsibilities, they were given few new targets and new commitments. Few new greenhouse gases were also added to the list, which had to be reported by the countries that were implementing these targets. But this time, through the Doha Amendment, the overall target of Kyoto Protocol was raised. In the first commitment period, the goal was to reduce emissions by 5% as compared to 1990 levels. But in the second commitment period, the target was raised to 18% reduction in emissions as compared to 1990 levels during this second implementation period. So the overall target was raised from 5% reduction to 18% reduction. So that is why the Doha Amendment is very, very significant. And Kyoto Protocol provided for several mechanisms to achieve these targets and to implement these targets. Under this protocol, the countries, that is Annex B countries, they primarily have to meet their targets through their national measures. That is, they have to bring out few national laws and policies so that they can adopt cleaner technologies. They can move away from carbon and adopt cleaner forms of fuel, adopt solar, wind, nuclear power if required. But the idea was to push them away from carbon-based industries and carbon-based agriculture. The idea was to tackle deforestation and promote afforestation, because forests are a natural carbon sink, right? So any such measure could be taken up by these countries which were listed under Annex B. It's up to them. They have to decide how they will achieve the target. Every country, based on their historical emissions, they will be given an emission reduction target. They have to bring down their emissions year on year as per the given target, and through their national laws and policies, they have to decide how they will reduce their emissions. For example, they can shut down coal-based power plants and switch to solar power. They can make their industrial processes more efficient. They can make their vehicles, transportation more efficient to reduce emissions. Right? They can switch to electric vehicles from fossil-based fuels. So through such national strategies, countries are supposed to achieve their targets. Apart from that, Kyoto Protocol also provided for innovative mechanisms for carbon trading, and it created a carbon market as well. It provided for very unique market-based mechanisms through which Annex B countries can achieve their targets. Mechanisms like international emissions trading was introduced. Through this, a country, let's say Canada for example, let's say Canada has been given a target of 50 gigatons of CO2. I'm just taking a hypothetical example here. Let's say Canada can't emit more than 50 gigatons of CO2 in a given year. That is the target given to Canada. Let's say US also has been given the same target. But United States might fail to implement the reduction measures, and eventually, based on its final reporting, its overall emissions for that year might be 53 gigatons of CO2. Okay? So US has breached its target, exceeded the emissions target by 3 gigatons. On the other hand, Canada might have invested in cleaner technologies. It might have invested in solar power, in cleaner fuels, cleaner technologies, and it might have brought down its emissions, and its overall emissions for that year might just be 47 gigatons. So now what Canada can do is, it can monetize the remaining units. Right now, Canada has earned 3 extra gigatons of CO2. This can be converted into trading units, carbon trading units, known as CER. It stands for Carbon Emission Reduction, Certified Emission Reduction. It stands for Certified Emission Reduction. It is a certificate that certifies that this country has saved these number of emissions, these units of emissions. Those certified units can be traded in the carbon market. It is similar to how you trade your financial instruments, financial derivative instruments, right? Just like you trade in gold or bonds or in commodities. Similarly, a country which had achieved the target and had earned CER or Certified Emission Reduction or carbon credit, this carbon credit could be sold, traded to other countries which had breached their targets. So US, in this example we have taken, US which has breached the target can purchase the carbon credit units from Canada. Canada will earn money through that, revenue through that, and Canada will be incentivized to shift to cleaner technologies. Countries like US which are breaching the target can pay for the contribution they are making to climate change, and that will be a disincentive for them, so that they'll be pushed to invest in cleaner technologies. The idea was to push countries to reduce emissions around the world, right? Because emissions, if it reduces in Canada or in US, doesn't really matter at the end of the day. That is one side of the argument, right? One sector, one side of the argument, they support this market-based mechanism, because if countries are breaching their targets, they can pay for it. That creates a disincentive and pushes them to invest in cleaner technologies. So overall, at the global level, there will be reduction of emissions. So such market-based mechanisms were created. But there has been a lot of criticism against this as well, because it allows ways for developed nations to breach their targets. Countries, they may not care about their targets, they simply might breach them, pay money for that and purchase carbon credits from other countries which have actually achieved emission reduction, right? So that will not really help the goal of climate change. And this is the criticism against the market-based carbon trading mechanism. It also provided for Clean Development Mechanism, CDM, through which Annex B country, that is countries which are developed, industrialized, which have been given binding targets, they can fund clean projects in developing nations, in non-annex countries. Even for this, they will earn carbon credits. For example, let's say France can fund a solar project in India. India is a non-annex country. France will earn carbon credits and it can sell that in the carbon trading market, right? Next, another mechanism called joint implementation was created, through which Annex B countries can collaborate. That is, two developed nations can work together and help each other to achieve their targets. Let's say, for example, UK can collaborate with Canada. UK can fund a clean project in Canada and UK will earn carbon credits which can be used to meet its national targets. So such a target-based, market-based mechanism was created through the Kyoto Protocol. Many trading mechanisms were created like emissions trading, clean development mechanism and joint implementation. And to ensure that the countries are meeting the targets, a thorough review and monitoring mechanism was put in place. This is the best part about Kyoto Protocol. A review and monitoring mechanism was put in place to ensure that Annex B countries are meeting their targets. They had to report on their progress. They had to provide periodic reports to the Climate Change Convention to show that they are complying with the given targets. If they are breaching the targets, they have to purchase carbon credits from other countries which have actually achieved a reduction in emissions. So such a monitoring mechanism was put in place and even an adaptation fund was provided for to provide funding for developing nations and underdeveloped nations. An adaptation fund was set up through which climate finance could be generated, through which developed nations, Annex B countries will pool their money, their resources together, and financial assistance could be provided through this adaptation fund so that the most threatened countries can take adaptation measures. Low-lying countries, especially like Maldives, the Pacific Island states, countries like Bangladesh, right? All these countries are very vulnerable to climate change and rising sea levels. So they would receive assistance to the adaptation fund and they can take adaptation measures to protect themselves against the threats posed by climate change. So these were the important features and provisions of Kyoto Protocol and it was implemented in two different periods. As of now, Kyoto Protocol is no longer in place because it was replaced in 2015 through the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement became the second binding agreement under Climate Change Convention. Currently, Paris Agreement is the primary climate change treaty, right? It essentially replaced the Kyoto Protocol. But nevertheless, many countries followed their commitments until 2020, and that is why Kyoto Protocol is very, very important. So on this note, I would like to conclude my discussion and take a look at your questions. First question, is water vapor considered as a greenhouse gas? See, technically speaking, yes, water vapor is a greenhouse gas because water vapor in the atmosphere, it traps heat, it acts like a greenhouse gas, right? So when you're speaking just from an academic point of view, water vapor is definitely a greenhouse gas. There's no doubt about it. However, it is not part of Kyoto Protocol, right? Under Kyoto Protocol, only those listed greenhouse gases have been identified because they're directly released through human activities, through industrial activities. Water vapor is not a direct byproduct of industrial activities. It could be indirect, right? So under Kyoto Protocol, under Climate Change Convention, water vapor is not targeted, right? We can't exactly control the release of water vapor into atmosphere. It might be impractical to do that, right? Water vapor is released through various natural processes as well. So focus of Climate Change Convention and these agreements is to focus on industrial greenhouse gases released through human activities and anthropogenic activities. Next question, what do we mean by limiting greenhouse gas emissions below 1.5 degrees Celsius but above pre-industrial levels? See, under the Climate Change Convention, there is a target to keep global temperatures under a prescribed limit. In the Paris Agreement, a target has been set, that is to limit the rise in global temperatures to under 2 degrees Celsius. And in a best case scenario, the target is to limit the rise in temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This refers to the rise in global mean temperature, right? See, the Earth has a global mean temperature. The global mean temperature is rising because of climate change and global warming. So the target of the convention and the Paris Agreement right now is to limit this rise, to keep this rise capped at plus 2 degrees Celsius. Let's say if the mean temperature is 25 degrees Celsius, our goal is to ensure we don't cross 27 degrees Celsius. If you cross that, climate change might very well become irreversible beyond that point. So the initial goal is to limit the rise in temperature to under 2 degrees Celsius and in a best possible scenario to keep it under 1.5 degrees Celsius. Next question, what can we do to ensure developed countries take responsibilities? See, as developing nations, all we can do is put pressure on them. There are few developed countries which have been very responsible. For example, European nations are very, very responsible when it comes to climate change. They have never ignored their historical responsibilities. They've acknowledged historical emissions. They've agreed to take historical responsibilities. Countries like Germany, then even Italy, France, UK, many West European nations, they're all willing to contribute to climate action efforts. They're willing to take additional responsibilities. Problem is only from countries like US. Countries like US have hesitated because they don't want to curb their economic growth and industrial activities. So what can you do with such countries? It's only through diplomatic pressure. When climate change negotiations happen, you need to exert more pressure on them so that they play a positive role in implementing the targets. Right now under Paris Agreement, most countries are following the commitments that are given to them. Next, sir, what is Montreal Protocol? Don't worry, we'll have a separate session for Montreal Protocol next week. Please take a look at the next week's schedule, which has been posted in the community post section. So next week, we do have a session on Montreal Protocol. Next, sir, which countries are maximum emitters of carbon emissions today? See, the top 3 emitters are China, US and India. These are the top 3 emitters of greenhouse gases as of today. Okay, so guys, these were the questions that were there. I've tried answering as many of them as possible. I hope it was a fruitful session. I hope you understood the basics of Kyoto Protocol, what are its provisions and why is it significant. So if you liked it, do let me know by liking the video, press the like button, share the video with your fellow aspirants, take a look at other videos of knowledge series by visiting our YouTube page, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So that is it for today. Thanks for watching.